a very warm welcome to an hour-long adventure, I'm hoping. I'm very grateful to share our time together. The Nourishment Project, as Nicola had said, cultivates empathy, creativity, and perspectives. And these aspects are woven into the narrative. So let's start with perspectives. During the Tang Dynasty, which is about 7th through the 9th century, the Chinese population rose from 41 million to 53 million, a 22% increase. And there were many people living in crowded urban areas. And depending on the plumbing, waterborne diseases were a grave concern. In that context, drinking boiled water was critical for population safety. And so what's better than hot tea? Drop some leaves in boiled, sanitized water and refresh yourself without the worry of diseases. It's rather topical now, isn't it? So welcome to the story of tea. The Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and connecting to something much larger than ourselves. We pivot on scholarship, and here are some of the references that inform this presentation. Our timeline will cover about 20 centuries. Everything prior to year 0, I'm going to point to it with, is there a pointer right there, this purplish dot. Everything prior to that is going to be BCE, which is before current era, and everything subsequent is what used to be called AD, Anno Domini, is now known as CE, current era. So in the 6th century, the BCE, so I'm going to point somewhere in here, the Buddha emerged, and our story is going to start 1200 years after that, around the 2000 years, and it's going to start in China, move to Japan, and around the 16th century, the story will become about globalization with the Chinese-European tea connection. And then very rapidly, as can be seen, it's going to become a story about colonization. That's going to be the dominant story. As someone was mentioning before, I think it's Teresa Kennedy, right? That the Chinese used to trade silk for war horses from the Fergana region, as can be seen on the map on the right, which would be today around areas east of Iran, or all those areas. And these are the historic lucrative horse tea trade routes where they used to trade horses for tea. And up to the 19th, 20th century, these roads have seen carriers hauling about 300 pounds of tea on their back. And you can see them standing with a stick where they sit down and they rest a bit while they're standing. And they transfer them to animals to continue the journey. And even today, one sees Tibetan nomads, as you can see on the bottom right picture, making long journeys by foot because they buy their groceries for about a month, and they buy about 20 pounds of tea, lasts them about a month. And what I loved about the picture on the top, that cat sitting under the heater while the tea kettle is being put on, it's just a lovely image of the sense of community and relation that one gets sitting around a fire or even virtually drinking tea together. So 6th century was a very interesting time regarding religion. And beginnings are usually quiet, but around 570 AD, the Prophet Muhammad was born. And in the 6th century also, there was a South Indian monk who traveled east to spread the message of Buddhism. And you see him on the right in the distinct red robes, and he's quite non-Chinese looking in the painting. The Japanese revere him as the father of Zen Buddhism. They call him Daruma, which is the Japanese pronunciation of the Indian term for Dharma, which is principles of living. So Dharma becomes Daruma. And it's very interesting. Zen Buddhism, the term Zen, when Buddhism spread to initially China, it's the term for the Indian term for meditation is Dhyan. The Chinese pronunciation of Dhan was Chan. And when the Chinese religion spread to Japan, because initially Japanese revered Chinese culture. And so when Buddhism spread to Japan through China, the Chinese Chan becomes Japanese Zhan, which eventually becomes Zen. Isn't that fun to know? So that's where the initial stories of Buddhism comes about. And before I forget, in this picture, it's pretty much the folklore of Daruma, the father of Zen Buddhism. What you see him in there is that Daruma is earning the right to enter the Shaolin monasteries in China. He said the story says actually that he meditated for 9 years with his eyes open. And around year 5 or year 7, something like that, his eyelids started drooping because he was sleepy. And in anger, quite a non monk behavior, he pulled his eyelashes off and threw them on the ground, and voila, tea bushes sprang up. And so tea is embedded in the story of Buddhism because it allows the monk to stay awake, to keep up with their stringent meditation practices. It's a nice story. But anyway, Buddhism is essential to the spread of tea. It also has medicinal properties, but primarily it helps them stay awake for their spiritual practice, as can be seen the monks on the picture on the top. And they also use it to make sampa. So tea is used in many ways. In fact, the Himalayan monasteries, including the Potala Palace, were great established trade posts for tea. What the monk actually, I have to say this, what the monks did really well was transform a tea tree into a tea bush. So tea has many origin stories, with his tea lashes being pulled apart not tea lashes, eyelashes being pulled apart is one of them. But the more probable reality is that in the jungle covered mountains of Assam and North Burma, which would be, I know a lot of us in IWA travel, it would be in the areas of India called Arunachal Pradesh by the Namthapa National Park. This indigenous community, this is way before even the birth of Buddha. They probably observed monkeys eating tea leaves, realized that it was safe, and then the people followed suit. And then over time, interactions with the indigenous tribes and the Chinese population propagated the use of tea. And so now, over time, what the monks did was they prevented the bush from ever maturing into a tree by careful cultivation. So effectively, the tea tree or the tea bush, the tea plant as we know it now, is in a constant state of panic trying to mature. So Camellia sinensis, so tea is of the family of camellia plants. In Japan and China, tea bushes were grown outside the home. One simply had to pluck some leaves, put it into boiling water when you wanted to make tea. And originally, teacups were very, very small, much, much smaller than the teacups that we're used to now. And so if someone had 20 cups of tea a day, nothing unusual because they were tiny. And they're rather beautiful. You can see the collections. In Hong Kong, they have a wonderful museum of tea, beautifully stuff. And in terms of tea, Camellia sinensis, like all camellia plants, they grow very happily on gravelly hillsides. But there still remains one strand of tea that comes from tree teas, and that is the much valued pure tea from southern Yunnan province. Now, pure teas can be ridiculously speculated on. So before the 90s, it was quite cheap, like a few dollars a kilogram. Then from 2000 onwards, it's fluctuated to almost $1,000 per gram, depending on how old the tree is. At first, I was shocked when I realized that. And I realized, it's really no different than investing in a nice bottle of Bordeaux. You buy something from 1945, it'll cost you much more than that. So monks and merchants, which effectively is saying religion and trade, propagated tea. So we're going to start with trade. So long before Western culture, China had invented paper, and so they also used paper currency. Tea was also a form of currency. Tea rivaled and soon outranked silk as the currency of choice. And it makes sense because it's easy to carry because it's light. So historically, a value of currency diminishes the farther away you move away from the issue of the country of issue, whichever made the currency, but not so for tea bricks. They were much in demand because you could eat them if you really got hungry, and you could use them to barter. And so when you're bartering in remote areas, in times of emergency, beyond using it for food, it's welcomed everywhere. And people eat tea even today. They cook the leaves because it is a vegetable substance. You can cook it with onions and garlic and ginger and make a meal. IWA, about 2 years ago, my husband and I had got that visit to China. And when I went there in both Beijing and Shanghai, among the options given in the breakfast was a meal of tea. It surprised me. I never knew you could eat tea, but I did. It was quite interesting. And it's available for purchase even today, definitely online if you like. The green tea and the one on the bottom right, the green tea with the rose petal sample, rather beautiful and unusual. So we move to see what the monks and the merchants, how do they converge, and the Tao philosophies of and the refinement seep into the tea culture of the Tang dynasty. And the Chinese patron of the saint of tea is Lu Yu, who's the author of I Ching, or I think it's pronounced I Ching, do forgive me. And it is the classic of tea. And in Chinese, Qing implies a book. So this is that I Ching book, right? So this book is called Cha Ching. So it's similar to the concept of I Ching. And the I Ching is a famous book of divination. The book of tea is valued. In fact, it is the book that was used by the British and the Dutch later to really understand how to use tea. So this book from the 8th century was used 1,000 years later, about in the 19th century, when they wanted to learn how to make tea. But the thing about the Tang dynasty that I want to talk about, the Cha Ching book gives you lots of directions how to make the tea, down to the fact what kind of porcelain teacups to use for the tea. And here is where I marvel. In the Tang period, roasted tea leaves are shredded and added to boiling water. The Tang culture preferred blue glazed porcelain, so the inside is blue, to the backdrop of the reddish pure tea. So as you pour the reddish water into the blue, the background comes up this color of celadon green, and it is the color of jade, which is what the Chinese value. Isn't that something? The subtlety in how they use the porcelain to make the experience of drinking tea just magical. But the apogee of refinement comes with the Song culture. Their approach to everything, let alone tea, is sublime. The Song culture is known for sophisticated tastes, and their emperors who sung, they were all tea connoisseurs, and white tea was treasured. And the porcelain cups that they preferred were blue-black, dark brown, or deep purple. Many of the traditions of the Song culture was lost to tea. I mean, it's a loss to history, but also their method of drinking tea they had was what's called foam tea. It is not the same as matcha. It was entirely different. But what I want to focus on is their preferred porcelain, because it reflects their refinement. So here are some chawans, which is tea bowls from the Song period. The Chinese consider them treasures, and they exist only in Japan and are designated as a Japanese national treasure. They have a very, very clear provenance. They weren't stolen from China. They probably arrived through trade or as gifts. There's one in Tokyo, there's one in Osaka, and one in Kyoto. This is the one in Tokyo, the Yohen Tenmoku Chawan. It's black-based body with various sizes of blue and purple spotted patterns. So each spot, if you look at it carefully, has colors of iridescence that looks as if they're moving around. So one has to imagine the spotted pattern is the star crest, and the iridescence represents luster. So what is happening is when you look inside the teacup with the foam tea poured in there, it's representing the galaxies. So you technically behold the beauty of the cosmos in your hand when you're drinking out of this cup. This one is valued at $15.5 million. To have an idea of creating something like this, I think the true value is priceless. Aren't they gorgeous? Oh. Anyway, so in terms of how we are moving forward, so the Japanese revered the Chinese aesthetics and their philosophy, and that was the height of culture. So many of the Song refinements came to Japan, and the Japanese sensibilities took it to an entirely different level. And as one can see in this map, very soon, because the Mongols invaded China, most of the Song culture has been decimated, and what little remains is found a lot in their different, how shall I say it, preservation is a form of, if you reinterpret stuff, is a form of preservation. So a lot of these original Song ideas were well preserved in Japan. And even now, if you're art collectors, anything from the Song period, especially, the Northern and Southern Song, probably Northern Song also, are very rare, very highly valued. I just love how they approach stuff. So historically, when we talk about the Mongols coming in, the Mongol Empire was second only to the British Empire in terms of people and power. But in terms of land coverage, it's the largest land empire in the world. That's saying a lot. And it is during the time of the Mongols that we have a Marco Polo going back and forth. Because remember, during these times in 12th, 13th century, the Crusades have been over, all 5 or 6 of them. And because the areas of Middle East weren't happy with the Christians, so the Silk Road had stopped. But because of the Mongol conquest, the Mongols were great traders. They opened up the trade routes again. And so this time of Pax Mongolica allows traders to go back and forth. One of the traders being Marco Polo. And so he documented his study. But very curiously, none of his stories mention tea. Isn't that strange? So the story of tea now takes us to Japan. So it's late 16th century, and Buddhism has already been well established in Japan, along with the spiritual importance and the medicinal property of tea. An amusing story comes up. So there's a Japanese shogun, a ruler, who was apparently on his deathbed, and a monk, Aize, had been summoned for effectively reading the ruler his last rites. Or in a very humorous sort of way, Aize knew the ruler wasn't sick, that he effectively had a hangover. And so he gave him a cup of tea and it revived the emperor. And so what happens was, because he grew up and the emperor grew up, got better and was so grateful, he became a patron of tea. And so right at this point, tea gets the help and propagation, marketing from the emperor. Nothing better. If you want a marketing team, that's a good way of doing it. And so the Japanese patron saint of tea, just like you had Lu Yu with the Chinese, is a person called Sen no Rikyu. What is also very important, that Rikyu is credited for propagating the entirely Japanese perspective of wabi-sabi. He didn't create the idea of wabi-sabi, which is a philosophy of valuing or revering things that are seemingly damaged and are old. But he helps move it forward. So the tea rituals pivot around relations. And it's very subtle that the atom is as important as the universe itself. And so private tea houses, normally built away from the main house, were simplified down to the basics 10 by 10. And the really authentic ones look nothing like the ones we see on Pinterest or Instagram. No. Because in the real design, the way that it was initially dreamed up, there was nothing extraneous. Every utensil was chosen to represent your philosophy. There was only one flower allowed. This is what actually developed and brought into play the concepts of ikebana. There was only one hanging scroll. Each stone leading away towards the tea house is when you're leaving behind the rat race. So each step towards the tea house is a step towards introspection. The tea selected, how it served each guest, every moment was made with deliberate awareness. And so effectively, each moment was a meditation. And that only the essential remains. It was not about ostentation. It was not really about, oh, what teacup are you using? And then that's why I love to make sure that I wrote that quote down. How much does he lack himself, who must have a lot of things? I love that one. Anyway, so that tea house and this tea house, though they have captured the look of refined poverty, there's hardly anything there. I assure you, they're undoubtedly exorbitantly expensive to make. But I love how it boils down to the essential plain sparseness. This is probably my favorite tea house that I've seen, because such a tea house reveals the owner. The dignity of that dwelling resides in the dweller. It has got nothing to do with the outside stuff. And this teacup the chawan that I was showing, the Kutsagara chawan, it's deliberately asymmetrical. And The reason I'm showing this, you can look it up. It's actually got wonderful history and the artistry that goes into it. But there are also magnificent potters that are available right now today in America. In fact, two of brilliant ones are in Wisconsin, a Mackenzie and a Randy Johnston. The spirituality of their craftsmanship is absolutely magnificent, and they had their training and their apprenticeship with masters from Japan. Their work is sublime. It's wonderful. I think that's one of the first things I'll do when COVID is over. So embodying wabi sabi, this idea of kintsugi, is the traditional Japanese art of mending broken things with gold lacquer. And I'm grateful that I had the chance in the tea story to bring this into more view. On the left, we see a damaged teacup. Because one valued it enough, cared for it enough to mend it, that care makes it beautiful. So the concept of wabi sabi is really spellbinding, that when we lovingly, gently heal and illuminate our imperfections, these imperfections become adornments. And so this golden gash that one sees on that teacup, that imperfection is what lends beauty to this otherwise perfect cup. I feel the cup would have been boring without that which was broken. And if we apply that theory to human beings, isn't that what humanity is about? I think these are some of the best things I like about the story of tea. It's hardly ever about the drink itself. So while in Japan, Sen no Rikyu is propagating wabi sabi in the 16th century, the Portuguese ships have been harassing the coasts of China, smuggling goods. And so, to prevent further loss of tax revenues, the Ming rulers leased Macau to the Portuguese. And along with the traders come Jesuit monks, as is evidenced by the churches that we see in the back. And history repeats, monks and merchants, but in this case, the monks aren't Buddhists, they are Jesuit and Christian monks, enter the story of the tea. So this is present day Macau. And on the top, we see what the old Macau port would have looked like. Ships begin trade of goods. And by 1610, early 17th century, Europe receives the first tea shipment from a Dutch merchants. And so the Dutch got their tea from Java, Indonesia. And in Indonesia, tea is known as teh. That's why we call it tea, because the Chinese call tea cha. That is why in Europe and the rest of the world, because they were introduced to it through the Dutch, it's known by its Indonesian origins, tea. If you go to India and other parts of the world on the east side, tea is called cha. I think a version of that when you go to Panera Bread or Starbucks, they'll say chai tea. It's redundant. One is enough, chai. So around this time also, the story continues. There have been changes brewing in North Eurasia, and Russia has expanded her empires to include Siberia. And now the Russian borders extend all the way to the Pacific coast. Now, Siberia, as one can see on the top map on the right, it is almost 3/4 of the Russian landmass. And in the mid 17th century, I think around 1638 or 1640, something around that time, as a diplomatic gift, the Mongol king sent tea to Tsar Romanov on the left-hand side. And within 40 years of that initial gifting, there were established tea caravans routes going to China from Siberia. It was pretty cold, which made an impact. So that to go from Siberia all the way to China for the tea trade was a 16-month journey. And you're going through ice-cold Siberia. And so the tea leaves took up the aroma and the smoke of the nightly campfires that these caravans stopped at the end of the day. And so by the time it arrived at the Russian capital, the tea had a smoky tobacco flavor. And they brew it very, very strongly in the samovars. And then they water it down. And sometimes they add fruit jams to sweeten the tea. So it's a distinct Russian way of drinking tea, all because of the supply chain. It's how they bring the tea in. Tea is really fascinating. Any perspective you look at it from, it's beguiling. And so Russia is the only land mass route for the tea trade. The rest of it is mainly, for the initial part, was all sea routes, maritime trades. And someone had asked me again about the Silk Road, because these maritime trades started. This is one of the reasons why those ancient Silk Roads started to disappear. trade was going through the water because it was faster. So these are all connected. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So ships begin trade, and by 1610, the ships had started bringing tea over to Europe. The Dutch came, and then very soon, what happens to be very interesting in this story is that Catherine de Braganza, the Portuguese princess, around 1662, marries Charles II of England. And her dowry includes Tangiers and Bombay. She becomes Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland. So the Portuguese were already familiar with tea. And so she brings along with her dowry this habit of drinking tea. And because she's the queen, the entire royal court follows suit. She, Catherine de Braganza on the left, drawn that way anyway, she makes tea the aristocratic emblem of the royal court. And so tea parties become the range. And one of the reasons they become the range are these very pretty teacups, an example of which is shown on the right. So that happened because when tea was packed in the ships for ballasts, they used to pack up, boxes of porcelain, these Chinese porcelain. And until then, Europe had not seen porcelain. They had only used earthenware. So the beauty of the porcelain made tea drinking charming. So eventually, this love of porcelain opens up a cottage industry in Europe. And they're still around. Delftware, Wedgwood, all of them, they owe their genesis, all these brands owe their genesis to tea. And so England and all her colonies, which were quite big, it's grazing, they become tea obsessed. And by 1668, within 6 years of her marriage, British tea companies are establishing themselves in Canton. And the tea demand makes shipbuilding boom. And there becomes a race to be the first one to bring tea to England every year. The Peabody Estates Museum has really wonderful collection of things, and we can access them online. It works really well. So the Chinese like the tea revenue, but they do not allow outsiders, whom they call foreign devils, into the mainland. So the traders, even though they get the stuff, they have no idea how this thing is made, which is a distinct advantage for the Chinese. And so all the traders, British, Dutch, Portuguese, are contained in, as you can see on the picture on the left, on the remote islands like Linton, Canton, Macau, and new ports by Kowloon. Here, the Chinese merchant intermediaries for the Qing dynasty, they were known as the Hong. And so these administrations, the Chinese administrators, as you can see on the right-hand side, they're the Hong Hoppo. They were very powerful and they controlled all trades. And China is a marvelously self-sufficient country, and they needed nothing from Europe except maybe silver. Sometimes they like quaint little one-offs like mechanical clocks, but mainly the tea was paid for by silver. And China also did not allow their language to be learned by the foreign devils. And so all trade was conducted in a fascinating grammarless version, which is English in equal parts with Portuguese and Indian words, all pronounced as the Chinese heard them. So our term cash, for example, originated from the Portuguese term caixa, which means case. And that's because the Chinese coins had square holes in them. And the squarey box shape, the Portuguese equated with case, caixa becomes cash. So how many caixa are you going to give me? That caixa becomes cash. And the tea term caddy, where you store tea, it comes from the Chinese term for the weight, which they call catty. So how many catties of tea am I going to get? And they come in these boxes. So the Chinese term for weight, catty, becomes what we call caddy, where we store tea. So it's really interesting how etymology gets affected by trade. And even the term Mandarin, on the left, one can see in the London newspaper, Chinese mandarins. Well, the term Mandarin, as in the Mandarin Oriental, comes from the Portuguese word mandar, which means to order, because that's what these Chinese administration did. They gave orders. And so they ordered people around. So that's where the term Mandarin comes from. I find all these details fun. So in the 1700s, to help the British East India Company, the British Parliament allowed the East India Company to bypass the American middleman and sell directly to distributors. We all know that didn't go down well. But what one also needs to realize that the English settlers, because they were still coming to the 13 colonies, brought with them their love of tea to the American colonies. And so, what the British East India Company had been allowed to do by the British Parliament is add a 3 cent per pound tax to tea. Now, that's almost negligible because back then one couldn't afford a pound of tea, but it was just the principles of taxation without representation. We all know historically what happens. In 1776, Britain loses her colony, the first Brexit, and this newly formed America becomes one of the largest tea drinking countries in the world. And you see the painting by Paul Revere. America paid China for their tea because, once, just because you got rid of Britain doesn't mean you got rid of your habits. You still want tea. So ships start going plying to China to bring their own tea for the American colonies, and we paid for it through silver. And I found it very interesting. The silver came because the 13 colonies isn't America as we know it now. The silver came from Mexico, which was definitely not part of the 13 colonies. So how did we find all this silver? Because New Mexico it wasn't admitted as a state till 1912. Isn't that fun fact to know? Anyway, so what happens when all the tea has been poured over, but the next morning after this great Boston Tea Party, people still want their drink? This is what they used. New Jersey tea, which is a form of you can find this in, if you go on walks in, I'm not recommending it, in the forest preserves, you will find buckthorn family. This is what they used to have tea. So it became the patriotic beverage of choice because you couldn't tax this by the crown. So this is what they drank while the whole year the ship went to China to get the tea for the Americans. Odd little interesting facts. So bringing tea from the east to the west had many, many ripple effects. People started making bets which ships would arrive first at the port. And so they were set to leave the docks from Canton. So clippers left the docks around in December. And so by the time they arrived in London and also in America, the docks were full of people who bet which clipper is going to win the race. And the races also sometimes, depending on which ship it was, determined the price, because whichever came first set the price. And so the captains and the sailors were handsomely rewarded for speed. And so some of the best, how shall I say, the best seamen were not in the British Navy. They were usually in this merchant vessel ships. And America was very, very much a part of the shipbuilding story. Virginia built, Baltimore built clippers from the 1800s. All of them come from the timber from our land. And they have a lasting history. And not all of it is really lovely, because the ships were used for tea trade, slave trade, and then you'll soon find out drug trade as well. So because of the English habit of adding milk and sugar to tea, their voracious appetite for tea played a large part on the shameful history that we all share of slavery. Slaves weren't originally bought to grow cotton in the US. They were originally brought over for the sugar plantations in the Caribbean that was needed to grow the sugarcane because it takes a ton of strong labor. So they came here to grow sugar. And sugar is really behind the bitter history of slave trade. Tea spins some of the oddest spider webs. It's really eye-opening. So what is it? And so you can see more of the clipper ships that were whale, and ships have a fascinating and beautiful history. So as we move forward in the story of tea, because I could digress on any one of these, what is it about this vegetable substance? And this is the one from the London Natural History Museum. And I think this is a sample from, I think it says so, 1698. What is it about this vegetable substance that people just got hooked on? And that the patronage of royalty, both originally the Chinese emperors and then the English, spurred the popularity of tea. Well, it's prettiness. One cannot talk of tea without talking about tea wares. As I had said, when the teas used to come in the clippers, in for ballast, they used to pack them with the Chinese porcelain. And so porcelain became the rage. On the left, we see from the David collection, they show one of the porcelains we have all probably known and drooled over, Sèvres patterns. Each porcelain house, actually, be it Sèvres, Limoges, Wedgwood, any of them, they have a terrific history. Sèvres had the patronage of Madame Pompadour, the official mistress of Louis XV, and she is a fascinating woman on her own right. And she very, very astutely used diplomatic gifts of porcelain to cement her influence throughout Europe. And remember, this is during the times of the 7-Year War. She has created lasting beauty, and there is tremendous power in the fragility of this beauty. So on the left, they see this utterly beautiful gold design Sèvres tea sets, the footed teacups, and you get the blue from cobalt oxide. And on the right, we see the Lomonosov patterns because tea is going everywhere. Russia has it. Russian porcelain story is an hour by itself. We see teapots all the way across, and they each deserve more attention than I'm giving right now. So please look this stuff up. Everything in the Nourishment Project is available online because it's really about promoting curiosity. If you like any of this stuff, there are huge histories behind all of them. I drool over these Satsuma place sets. My God, they had one for every month of the year. I mean, talk about ideas of beauty and being able to express them in this way. The Hungarian Heron brand, it's very lovely. But porcelain also helped establish the demand for exquisite silverware because you're certainly not going to drink tea and what, you're going to stir the teacup with your fingers or ugly looking wooden sets. No, that doesn't do. Silverware. On the right, you have the Tiffany scallop shaped spoon, which is actually a wonderful tribute to something very historical. I'm going to show this in a second. Well, I can mention it now. You know, the Paul Revere, the painting that I showed before of the American Revolution, when he wasn't galloping about fighting for independence, he was a renowned silversmith. America has a very nice history in silverware. And these samovars, the one on the right from the Fabergé collection, you also have samovars that were made, designed for the Russians, but you can see from the maker's mark in the middle, the Chinese element in these designs. And I'm going to point now, I try not to use the pointers. You can see the curly Q Chinese cloud patterns in the Russian tea glass holders. The more you look, you will see semblance and clear clues that we do not exist in a vacuum. We are tied up historically and inevitably, and I think in a wonderful way, to each other all the time. It really does bring into bear what IWA is all about, isn't it? This is exactly what Doe talked about. We bleed into each other. Examples of teaware sets. This is Japanese, as can be deciphered from the chrysanthemum motifs of this set. Chinese, a giveaway from the dragon. And the Indian. I thought, even though this is almost 200 years old, it looks so strikingly modern. And which brings me to this aspect of the silverware set. These are moat spoons. So the previous Tiffany scallop shell spoon that I talked about, well, moat spoons are used in a tea service to pick out stray leaves in your teacup. So I took this picture about a year and a half ago when we were in London. There was a dealer in London who patiently explained to me, how do you choose between these two moat spoons? And these are not petty cash items, $500 each about. So not chump change. So he patiently told me, everything else being equal, the silver quality, all of them being equal, weight being equal, the one to buy is actually the cheaper one because it has the scallop mark in the back of the spoon, because the Chinese used to have scallops. They used to use actual scallops as spoons. So to have the scallop pattern in the back of the spoon is an homage to the originality of how spoons were used. History matters in design. It really helps sift price from value. I have never forgotten that story. Who doesn't like beauty? And in the 17th century, to keep up the demand for silverware to go along with these lovely porcelain sets, female relatives were brought into the trade. and they could only work under their husband's hallmark. And they would only get their own hallmark if they became a widow. And if they remarried, they lost that hallmark and they worked again under their husband's brand. So even though there were lots of women in the trade, there were very few records of women silversmith. But they did exist. And this is a very good book. And Hester Bateman, one collects her ware. Their work is really very remarkable and well worth your time should you spend to invest in learning more about them. As far as books are concerned, Euchre's is often cited as the book on tea. And I like to show this picture because it really correctly captures the prevalence of tea pretty much everywhere in the world, even in the Arctic. And this is one interesting part and a sad part of the history. Though the two teapots are very similar in shape and form, they have absolutely grave differences in function. I would like to title this Beauty and the Beast, because on the right is a Sèvres teapot. The other one on the left is not a teapot at all, it's an opium pot. Like tea, opium was first prescribed medicinally as a pain reliever. In reality, it caused more pain than it cured. So in the mid-19th century, the tea trade is thriving. And the appetite for tea in Britain is voracious. And the British Empire is becoming drained of their silver, paying the Chinese for the tea, because they still cannot have any access to the mainland. They have no idea how to make tea. They have zero idea where it comes from, except that it shows up in Canton in boxes. And simply for cost analysis, the British Empire starts effectively a drug war in China. They grow opium in Bengal in India, which is under the British Empire. And then from 1787, the British East India Company starts selling opium in China. And so opium was illegal in China. And so the British East India Company sold them, through private trades through the Chinese smugglers. The Chinese paid for the opium in silver, and this silver ended back in London, which was rerouted to China to pay for the tea. It's a very vicious cycle. And America did it as well. We got the lower priced opium from Turkey. So there were many people involved, many countries involved in this. And the Americans paid for their tea in Canton with the opiums they picked up in Turkey. And this illegal opium trade continued well on into 1839. And the Chinese High Commissioner had seized 20,000 cases of opium, which was there in the free trade region of Canton. And I need to make sure I point this out correctly. The Chinese High Commissioner had offered to exchange it for tea, but the offer was refused. And when it was refused, because it's completely illegal to have opium, the Chinese had dumped it into the ocean floor, as well they would have. But what that allowed was that the next year, Britain declared war on China to get financial reparations. So while this drug war is going on, the British in the meantime finally learned how to make tea. And so the Royal Botanical Gardens, both in Kew and the one in Calcutta, because at that time, India is part of the British Empire, had a great hand in changing global history. They finally discovered what it is that makes tea, Camellia sinensis. And so British simply took over areas in Assam to start cultivating tea. And so when you talk of the botanic gardens, the Kew Gardens, the ones in Scotland, the ones in then India, Calcutta, they were more than just gardens. They were huge vehicles for economic development of the British Empire. So within 10 years, because they started cultivating tea in British-controlled India, the demand for Chinese tea plummeted. And then all the British colonies, because there were quite a few, started procuring tea from British areas of India. And so the money started pouring back into the British Empire. The very sad thing is this context makes the opium wars even more egregious, because it was a senseless butchering of a nation just to pay for tea, and they figured out how to do it anyway. So in India, the British starts cultivating tea, and in China, they declare war. And the first Opium War of 1839 concludes with the Treaty of Nanjing signed in 1842. Among other things, China paid $21 million, huge amount back then, for reparations for the opium dumped into the ocean. And then they're forced to open up the Shanghai ports. That is how Hong Kong is ceded to the British Empire. It puts all that is going on with Hong Kong and China and everything else that we read about in a different context, doesn't it? But if that's not enough, that never ends. And in 1853, the Taiping Rebellion leads to the Second Opium War, and it ends around 1858. And a new treaty that they now have to sign opens up even further ports for the Europeans. It legalizes the opium trade and allows traders and missionaries to travel within China. I mean, these historic events are just, you read them in utter shock. But the Taiping Rebellion was mainly a conflict between the Manchurians and the Mandarins. And very oddly, I don't mean to bring humor to this effect, it has the revolutionary movement was, the leader of it was a village school teacher. I'm not making any of this up. He used to go into ecstasies. This man had flirted with American Methodism. And so he declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He had 30 wives, 100 concubines. I don't know how a character like this can exist, but he did. And so anyway, at the end of the Second Opium War, China lost a ton of land to Russia. There was chaos everywhere. And in this turmoil slips in a plant hunter, Robert Fortune, who takes advantage of the lack of supervision in areas in China that were formerly forbidden. He took what he wanted from the unprotected tea gardens. And, Fortune and all of this was under, there was well-known and supported by the Royal Botanic Gardens. And so the British Empire wasn't really a stickler for provenance when it comes to matters of money. And so all these tea and all these plants come over to England, which then they cultivate. So these are the historical trade wars with China. The irony is, because the irony just doesn't cease, at around this time in the early 20th century, end of 19th century, early 20th century, whenever there were teetotalers, people who eschewed alcohol, they favored tea as the moral drink. They either didn't know or they feigned ignorance because tea only came because it propagated a drug addiction in China. It's really weird how all global economies are connected, and it's still true now. So these are the pictures of the signing of the Second Opium War. And this is what happens when Assam, that the British took over to grow tea, all this natural teak and mahogany forests were denuded to cultivate tea. And though now we think these tea estates and the tea gardens are beautiful, which they are, but monoculture is never, ever a good thing. So tea can grow anywhere, and it has been tried to be grown even in South Carolina. It are these women that guarantees the longevity of the Indian tea system. No one can match the price of their expertise, which is about $3 per day. Their labor cost, no one can match that. That's why the Indian tea markets aren't going anywhere. They tried to get a 50-cent per day increase in salary. It didn't go through. I mean, it looks all picturesque, but it's backbreaking work. And so you will see them often if you go to any of the areas in the Himalayas and the Darjeeling areas. They have, I'm going to point, they all have umbrellas in their tea baskets. One, because it is wet and misty, but also because there are tigers in those areas and snakes. It is both a utilitarian reason for protection of weather and just protection from natural elements. But the queen of all the black teas, which is called Bohea tea, cultivated by the British, is in Darjeeling. It's called the champagne of teas. And even today, one can ride these charming tea trains, these steam engine and they call them toy trains, and they curve around the Himalayan curves. It's really beautiful. And the verdant tea gardens against the backdrop of the azure sky, it is lovely. So let's look at pretty teas. On the top left, what one can see is what would probably be the closest thing to the Song culture foam tea that one can imagine. It's called buku buku chai. It is foam tea. They whip them. You can see that on the top picture here. Up here, we see the pinkish tea, which is the quintessential Kashmiri tea. It's called noon tea. Noon not meaning midday. This is NUN, which is the Indian word for salt. So it's salty. It's that which gives the color pink to it. And then there's saffron tea on the bottom left. All the places in Iran, they grow saffron, and Kashmir also grows a lot of saffron. So saffron tea, you mix it in with honey. It's very fragrant and very nice. We see again the quintessential American drink on the bottom left. It is the iced tea. Yummy. It was popularized in the St. Louis Fair in 1904, but if you look at old American cookbooks, it's been in the cookbooks much prior to that. And I was looking for something fun to show, and who knew on the bottom right, look here, tequila. I suggest you guys try some this afternoon after this presentation is over. You might want it. And what goes better with tea in the afternoon tea than tea snacks? So on the top left, we have the Korean manju. So I believe it's sweet pastry with a red bean paste. And on the right, the dim sum, savory and sweet. On the bottom left, you have the Japanese bean cakes with chestnuts and sakura mochi and rice crackers. They're really nice. My children love it, dango. And on the right, the sweetness of it is the barfi, the Indian sweets. They are made of effectively very much like marzipan, except these are made with cashews. And you cannot go anywhere without the British charm of the tea sets. On the bottom right is actually the Turkish delights, beautifully pink there, but the clotted cream and scones are standard in the British. And when we go to many of the hotels in London now, they'll have eye-watering and really striking setup for the tea. This one was done to commemorate that English show Killing Eve. So this designer makes the tea cookies and the pastries in the shape of what the characters in the show is wearing. So it is rather seasonal per the show. But regardless of anywhere you travel in the East, anywhere in Asia, you're offered what's called pulling tea, the art of drawing out the tea so you thereby cool it and then also foam the tea. So whether you're in Pakistan or India or on the bottom right, if in Morocco, they will offer you, in Morocco anyway, pulling of the Moroccan mint tea. And all through Africa, you can get that. But the essence of tea is what I feel the Japanese patron saint Senno Rikyu had said is relation. Tea with friends in Japan or in the Ritz in London or in the tea hops in China where you rap on the table for a refill. It is really about the conviviality, the sense of sharing our humanity with loved ones and friends. Sit around and have tea with real ones or imaginary ones or virtual ones like you and I. It's this sense of camaraderie, like here we share something and sit around and enjoy these moments of our life. And so I would say here's to your good health. And if you enjoyed this presentation, I'm really grateful you shared your afternoon with me. And it's always nice to spend time with IWA members because we all share a love of learning and of culture. Next week, there is one on words. If you're interested, you can go to the Nourishment Project website. And next year, here is the list of subject matter that I'll be covering. I'll just quickly go over it. January starts with the topic erotica. Its title, Works for the Imagination. And I promise you, it is more John Donne than Hugh Hefner. It has got nothing to do with pornography. February, it's about contracts. It's titled Beautiful Deeds because it's the visual poetry of contracts. Contracts don't always look like white paper with printing and 10 pages of nonsense and you sign on the bottom. It didn't look like that at all before. March, Around the World in 80 Birds. April, it's on sand. It's creation through erosion. It's an entirely sustainable story because sand is behind so many things: glass, pottery, construction, Silicon Valley, all sand. In May, it's life. It's really about time because the measure of time is life itself. You measure time through life. Otherwise, it's a very abstract concept. June, titled Adornment, in praise of mollusks, which is the story of pearls. July, the title is Ozymandias, that very school taught poem, except it's not about the poem really. It's really about four cultures that were the apogee of success during the time, that they no longer exist. Includes Petra Jordan, it includes people of the Incas, it also has places of Angkor Wat. That's the story of July. August, during the hot months, the title is Adam's Ale, which is the other word for water. September, the title is Supply Chain, but the supply chain that I'm interested in is genetics, because the ultimate supply chain is our DNA. October is Salt and Pepper, true to form, nothing tricky about that. November, the title is Photography, Eye of the Cyclops, because I think a digital camera and the old camera, not the point and click iPhone, with this one lens looks like the eye of a cyclop. And December, it ends with the title is Shangri-La, the subject matter is escape. What do we escape to? And the more you find out historically and even now geographically what people escape to, some might escape to deep sea fishing, others may escape to books. The escapes that we use are really fascinating. More than anything else, and especially in this holiday season, I wish you joy. I'm going to stop sharing now, and thank you again for your time. That's it. I suppose, are there any questions or